Good evening and welcome to tonight's inaugural podcast webinar featuring Alicia Post. Personally, I could not think of a better person to launch the webinar series for Taking Back the Narrative. You know, when major events happen in Jewish life, Jewish current events, I always think, I wonder what Alicia thinks about this topic. I wonder what Alicia's take is. So I want to welcome everyone. So tonight's style is going to be more conversational podcast. We both think it's going to be more informative and more engaging. We will be having the second half more interview style, just to get Alicia's exclusive take on the topic of Jews knowing who we are and how that helps combat anti-Semitism. And we will leave room for Q&A at the end. Although Alicia is renowned in the Jewish Zionist community and needs no introduction, her career is incredibly impressive and deserves to be highlighted for tonight's audience. Alicia Post is a Jewish community builder and nonprofit professional who has been working on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people for more than 2 decades. Alicia dedicates much of her time to enhancing Jewish life by helping to create meaningful connections to Israel and building Jewish identities for individuals and organizations throughout the US, with a specific focus on the young professional community and social media. She has been at the forefront of Israel advocacy for over 2 decades and has recruited and organized student leaders on college campuses across the country to host and promote a variety of events and educational programs. Alicia started her career at Taglit Birthright Israel, after which she served with pride as Chief of Staff to the Executive Director of the Jewish National Fund, one of my favorite organizations. Alicia has participated in numerous fellowships, including a recent Conference of Presidents pilot social media program, held various board positions, currently including Atlanta Israel Coalition, Mosaic, and Olam Shalem. She has been a Simon Wiesenthal Center mentor for their government advocacy internship program for the past 3 years. Very impressive. As the national program and communications director of the AZN and lead coordinator for the American Zionist Youth Council, Alicia is proud to continue to play a role in enhancing relationships between American Jews and Israel. Welcome, Alicia.
Ooh, thank you. I feel old when you say 2 decades, but I really appreciate it. And I'm really honored to be here, proud to be part of this initiative.
Absolutely. I could not think again of a better person to start off this webinar series, to be part of the advisory committee. I was so honored when you said yes and agreed. And so I would like to kickstart today's topic, just like it says, right? So Jews knowing who we are helps combat anti-Semitism. I think that we, not just us and the participants tonight, but I mean, we as a Jewish community at large, especially here in America, I think it's high time that we really know who we are, right? And so there's so many groups of people of all backgrounds, right? So French people know that they come from France. Brazilian people from Brazil, before that from Spain, from other parts across Europe. English people know where they come from. Italian people here in America, they're proud Americans and they know their roots, right? And proudly so. In my own hometown, we have residents who fly their Italian flags next to their American flags. We have Irish residents who fly their Irish flags next to their American flags, and proudly so. And I think when it comes to the Jewish community, the recent, obviously, Whoopi Goldberg comments, as much as many of us disagreed and were just, mind-boggling what she had said, because it was so incorrect that, it was 2 white groups, in World War II fighting each other. We know that's not true. But I think that in a way, it was for a blessing, because her remarks, her very anti-Semitic remarks, sparked this conversation. I think that needs to be had, right? So you had Jews in America who agreed with her, saying that, yes, Jews are white. You had Jews like us who completely were disgusted by her comments. And then some of us went a little bit further and thought, but this has that connection, right? To the identity that we have and how this all links back to Israel.
Right. And clearly it's one of many issues, right? Like there's just countless, like this is one that we talk about and we're aware of, and it did help spark a lot of conversations. And I think it was so important. And as you said, this topic is so important, right? Like we need to know who we are to be able to explain to people and to be able to, dispel any, myths about the lack of, our connection to Israel. As a Jewish people, obviously, Israel is our homeland and who we are. We're Jews. We came from Judea, right? That's who we are. So
I am so glad you said that, because the story of taking back the narrative, right? And why does it exist in the first place? I get asked that question so often, right? There's so many Jewish organizations. Why add another one? And I'll be honest, right? And this is on the website also, www.tbtnisrael.com. It serves a couple purposes, right? The first is to become a comprehensive Zionism education tool. And one of the main goals of TBTN is to fill in the 2,000-year quote unquote gap that's not really being talked about in our community, right? So a lot of organizations, and all Jewish organizations, contribute so much positivity. But I really felt that there was this disconnect about talking about biblical times and then suddenly end of World War II in 1948. And when there's this missing 2,000-year quote unquote gap, that is where one of the most prevalent anti-Semitic lies comes into the picture, right? That Jews left for 2,000 years.
Continuous presence.
The Arabs settled in Palestine. And then we as white Jews, right? Because apparently now we're European and white, we came back and we stole the land. And let me tell you something, scarily, I, as a Jew, actually believe that for a long, long time. Despite my going to Israel for the first time in 1995 for my bat mitzvah, I consumed the incorrect lies in the media. And I believed all that. I really thought, how I grew up, right? I looked at my skin tone. I was light. Forget about the fact that there were many olive-skinned toned people in my own family that I didn't really process, right? That my people, at that time I didn't understand what that was, came in all sorts of shades, right? That we were just white. I remember growing up, people would ask me, what's your background? And I would say Russian, because 3/4 of my immediate family spoke Russian, came from Russia. And I didn't bother to ask further questions, right? So it wasn't for me until college, well, I would say high school, college, that I even dug into the background. Well, where was my family before Russia, right? Belarus.
Right.
And so then I found out, well, we were in Germany, right? My last name, Lipsky, originated in Leipzig. And then I started asking questions. Well, where was our family before Germany, right? Like I wanted back as much as I could. So, then I found out Italy, a little bit of Portugal. And I heard those stories growing up, but I was thinking, wait, but we speak Russian, right? Like my first language was Russian. It was definitely not, Italian and Portuguese, and certainly not Hebrew. So for me, it was only when I became an outspoken Zionist very recently in 2014, and I started reading about the Jewish genetic links and connection, like you said, to Judea, especially, right? Because that's where all modern Jews are linked back to, the tribes of Judah, the tribes of Benjamin. And then there was the priest, and there was the parts of the priestly class, the Levi tribe, even though not really a tribe, it was more of a class of people from different tribes. And so there have been this studied genetic link, right, that links all modern Jews to a very specific part of Israel, right? Judea and Samaria, that people now erroneously call, anti-Semitically call West Bank. But for me, it took that deep rooted knowledge of who I was as a Jewish person, right? And understanding that clear link to Israel, that all made sense to me, that I just wasn't Russian. So I want to turn it to you and ask.
So much to unpack. Yeah, go ahead.
So much
Sorry.
to unpack, so much to unpack. And, we did talk a little bit, off camera about that. And so what I wanted to ask you is, growing up, did you feel white?
So first of all, growing up, I went to public school. I always knew I was Jewish. In fact, one of my first memories was, helping to free Soviet Jewry, which we can get back to after. And I still have the red scarf. And
my family,
yeah,
for that. Thanks to your family also.
And my sister had a twin, and we could, spend a lot of time talking about that, but I'll say that I was in elementary school, and I remember they said, everyone stand up, say your name, and say where your family comes from. And Angelo stood up first. We went in order, and he said, my family's Italian, and Natalia stood up and said, my family's Puerto Rican, and Christina stood up and said, I'm Austrian and Switzerland, whatever. And I stood up and I said, I'm Ukrainian, Romanian, Prussian, which is Germany, English. I'm an Eastern European Jewish mutt. And somebody yells, Jewish is a religion, you idiot. And so again, when people ask me now, I'm like, Judean, and I think it's a really interesting classification. But I was recently ran into somebody right after the whole Whoopi Goldberg incident, and I was filling out a form. And there were two forms actually, but one form I was filling out, and I, of course, it's white, Black, Native American. I checked non-Hispanic, and then I checked other. And I was standing by somebody I knew, and I was like, yeah, other. And he goes, white. And I'm like, no, other. Like, we're Semitic people. Like, we're not white. Like, even I may look white, and I was doing a COVID test, and they only had very limited options. And I sat there like hemming and hawing. They didn't have an other. And I was like, I don't know what to put. I don't fit in these boxes. And I just think it's a wild situation that, we're other, and that there's not a place where we fit in. But you did mention about names. My last name, it was actually shortened from Postelnik. And of course, I have a Hebrew name, which is actually Yiddish. I don't know if you have a Hebrew name as well.
A made up one. So I did not know that I was Jewish until I was 7 or 8 years old. And the story is a little crazy, but I'm comfortable sharing. So my parents emigrated in 1979 from the former Soviet Union, and they were so busy with jobs and a new child, just assimilating to a new country. And again, when religion is taken away from you, it's not just religion, it's also the cultural practices, right? So my parents did not grow up having bar and bat mitzvahs. They didn't grow up with any sense of religion. They had to sneak in to celebrate Pesach, but my parents did not really understand why they were celebrating Pesach, because everything had to be so undercover. And luckily, there were some Jews who did keep their traditions, but that was by far the minority, right? I grew up with my grandparents telling us how they had to talk quietly when it came to anything, pertaining to their religion or even their ethnicity, because it was whispered about. And I find that really ironic, right? Because at the same time, USSR would put Jew, literally Jew, on their passports, right? So in a way, it was positive how we look back on it now. Of course, it was done for negative purposes, but it was positive because that government did recognize that Jews are a different ethnicity, right? But unfortunately, the reason they did that was to distinguish who was not Slavic, right? And so it was always done in the name of the other, right? And my mom would always tell me growing up, when I was getting older, she wanted to be Belarusian so badly, right? Because all her friends had Belarusian on their passports, and she was labeled as a Jew. So I grew up, we had my grandparents over for holiday meals. And again, this was passed down to me. Nothing was explained why we're having this meal, lovely meal with our grandparents. And so being an impressionable 7, 8-year-old, I was watching Lassie on TV. And I remember the main character, little Timmy, was the classical American blonde, blue-eyed Christian little boy. I don't, do you remember that show at all?
A little bit, a little bit.
Okay. So it was about a little boy and his dog, and every night before bed, he went down on his knees and he crossed himself and he prayed to Jesus. And I will tell you that for a good, I would say, couple of weeks, I did the same thing, right? Because here's this child, my age, praying to Jesus, then that means all children pray to Jesus. So I was doing this probably more than a couple of weeks. So one night my dad walks by my room and says to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, Dad, I'm praying to Jesus before bed." And he says to me in a very stern voice, "Okay, we need to have a conversation." That was the night I found out, not Christian, that I was Jewish, right? And it's crazy, right? So genetically, I was Jewish all along, but in practice, because it was in a way taken away from me and my immediate family members, I truly thought I was someone else with identity.
No, absolutely. You mentioned your first trip to Israel. I'll tell you very briefly, my first trip to Israel, I was 16. I went to Poland, Israel pilgrimage. And I'll never forget, landing in Israel and looking around and understanding who I was for the first time and where I came from. And I remember, being a couple of years later or whatever, being on Birthright and being in Binyanei Haman, looking around and seeing Jews from all over the world and saying, "Oh my gosh, these are my people. Like I make sense and I'm home." And it was just such an amazing feeling because I never resonated to all these other countries. And my religion, my culture, my nation, and the language, shared language, it was just such an amazing experience for me. And being there. I also just want to mention really quickly, if anyone has questions at any point, feel free to shoot them, and later on we'll get to as many as we can. Just wanted to throw that in.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned that you saw all different types of Jews, right? And so I think that and I'll go out and say this, right? Because I think we need to be honest about this, is that here in America, we as a Jewish community at large, it's lopsided, very much Ashkenaz, right? Whereas in Israel, it's 61% Sephardic. And Sephardic obviously also incorporates Mizrahi. Here, like how I grew up, like the Jews that we had in our town, they were all Ashkenazim. I didn't know anything about Mizrahi Jews until probably even, I would say 7, 8 years ago, or I would say 10 years ago at this point. Only when I became involved in the Jewish community. When I moved to New York, I had no Jewish friends. All my friends were non-Jewish, and they would ask me questions about Israel, about my people, right? And I answered from a very Ashkenazic, as I would say, standpoint, because I didn't know that we had all of these, relatives, right? Like across the board. And so when Jews say that they're white, lately, now that we know the truth and the genetics and how we're all tied, I'm thinking that is actually erasing the Mizrahim and the Sephardim, right? Because they're certainly not white at all. I have a lot of Mizrahi friends right now, and when we text each other, the emojis they use, it's always the brown, hand emoji, or the brown, like muscle, strong emoji. And you go to Israel and you ask, Israelis, like, are they white? And they would look at you as if you're crazy if you ask that kind of question. So I really think that having that Ashkenazi majority mindset is just very inaccurate, right? And it does us no favors as a people, right? Because that's exactly where the anti-Semitism is able to burrow in to itself and attempt to delegitimize our very real, very genetic connection to Israel.
Right. And obviously we're a minority. And I think growing up in the experience I did, going to public school and having pennies thrown at me and being called to kike and literally dealing with anti-Semitism, which people don't necessarily believe when I say I grew up on Long Island. And, you know, but I think that that truly made me understand being a part of the Jewish people and being that minority and, you know, feeling the need to fight. Like I always knew I wanted to make the world a better place and I didn't quite know how. And then when I learned about things like birthright and, you know, I said, oh, I don't have to be a rabbi or whatever, work at the synagogue or whatever. I said, there's Jewish organizations, there's life outside that, there's ways that you can work to support your people, to be involved and, you know, do things that can help create change and create awareness and education and help combat anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, you know.
It's absolutely tied. And so I think also, you know, a lot of Jews that, from my personal stance that I've come across, they're very afraid to use race when it's applied to Jews, right? And you know, I think especially for Ashkenaz Jews, that's definitely tied to you know, the Holocaust, right? And so Hitler, obviously, it wasn't obviously wrong that we're a race, because we are. What was obviously appalling and ultimately evil is that the Nazis deemed Jews an inferior race. And I think that, you know, I understand like a generation past, you know, the Shoah, like of course there's that, you know, that reaction with race, but the very thing that Jews were running away from when, you know, there was that massive, you know, immigration to America post World War II is now coming back, honestly, to bite us, to delegitimize Israel, right? It's like, oh, well, you know, Jews are invaders from Europe, right? Like how often do you hear that, or do you see that on social media? That
Yeah, and
we're from Europe.
it's also really important to dispel the myth that like Israel exists solely because of the Holocaust, like a, you know, and that's something that I don't think people know and understand, you know. And I did mention anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and of course, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, as we know. You know, people that would say it wasn't, I would say it almost always manifests itself as such, you know, and really, you know, you have the right to criticize Israel, but you know, to in any way, you know, and you know, call out anything, and that's, you know, part of the importance of knowing who you are in order to combat those things. So
Absolutely. And then we're talking about, you know, just us as a people, right? So not all Jews are observant, right? Like I know that you are very interesting observant journey, and it would be great if you can share that with our audience, you know, a little bit later in the conversation. But, you know, personally, I'm secular. I have a little foot within Chabad, and I really appreciate that. I'm on my own journey, but, you know, not just because a Jew is not observant does not make them any less of a Jew, right? And so I don't think we've ever talked about this, but, you know, there is a distinction, or at least there could be a distinction, right? Because, you know, Jews can feel Jewish, right? Participate in Jewish activities and cultures, customs, but we're all still individually a Jew, right? And so I think there's also that conundrum, right? It's like a little like you mentioned before, that Judaism, right, many still consider a religion. Like I remember I was talking to this one influencer, she was a food influencer, and I had said, oh, how come when you go to Israeli restaurants, you don't mention that they're Israeli? You mislabel them as Mediterranean, right? That's something that a lot of Jewish influencers unfortunately do. And I said, you know that Israel is under attack all the time. Why not highlight all of the great Israeli restaurants we have here in the city? And her retort back to me was, what does my religion have to do with this? Instead of understanding that this is a sisterhood.
Well, I do think it's important to clarify the difference between religious and observant. That's one thing I will say, that, you know, for me, I like to say, you know, are you observant? Because there's many people who are religious Reform Jews, for example, you know. So I think that there is a distinction to me in terms of, how observant you are. That's one thing I would say. But again, my Hebrew name is Yiddish, I was saying before, and the reason I bring it up, you mentioned Chabad, it's Mindalea. And when I was little, I thought it sounded like Cinderella. It was this beautiful name. And I got older and somebody said, oh, you should use your Hebrew name. And I said, oh, it's Mindel. And I was like, ooh. And they were like, oh, or Mindy. And I'm like, no, I'm an Alicia, And one day I was at a Chabad Shabbat lunch or dinner, and their son was named Mendel. And they're like, oh, Mendel, come here, like Menachem Mendel. And I go, oh, Mendel, like it made so much sense, And then of course, Alicia, and like it just all came together for me. So I thought that was a cool moment to share.
No, absolutely. That whole, like the peoplehood, right? And so I wrote in a recent op-ed of the same name, right? Jews knowing who we are helps combat anti-Semitism. And, if we think about it from this point of view, right? Like you and I, we are fair-skinned, right? Like our immediate family, I hate saying coming from, because the provenance of Jews is not Europe, right? So Europe, North Africa, parts of the Middle East, that's just where Jews spent a good portion of the diaspora, right? Like we're not from those places. And anyone can tell that, realistically, logistically, just of how many places we've been kicked out of, right? Israel's not kicking out Jews now that we have, sovereignty again. And so we were always just dispensable, to various rulers when they used us, because obviously Christians, couldn't lend. So they put us in this, awful position of basically money lenders, right? And charge us with usury. And then when we were attacked, we were just shipped off to the next country. So another reason that Ashkenaz people, or, as some say, that doesn't even make sense, right? Because if you think about it, all Ashkenaz started off as Sephardic Jews, right? We traveled east, from Israel, like we ended up in the Iberian Peninsula. That was one way we ended up in Europe. Another way we ended up in Europe was through Italy, either as traders or taken as slaves by the Roman Empire. So yes, like some Jews ended, in Europe voluntarily. Some were taken, by force, right? Like who built the Colosseum? Now there's more and more evidence a lot of the Crusaders were Jews, right? Not just the Christians. And so if you look at the migratory patterns, the Ashkenaz region, Jews did not just appear out of magic there at a certain point, right? Like we migrated through. And so in terms of skin color, right, we have more in common, of Ashkenaz background to Mizrahi Jews than we do from anyone from, let's say, Eastern Europe or Western Europe that are non-Jewish, right? Like if we needed, let's say, bone marrow as Jews, we wouldn't be matched with someone who is not Jewish, right? There are separate bone marrow banks for Jews. They're distinct Jewish, genetic diseases that they test for when women are pregnant, right? There's a reason.
There's a lot of them. And again, it's not my area of expertise, although, of course, there are people who are adopted and people who convert and, many other things, but I do understand, what you're saying. One thing I didn't mention earlier when we talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think the third thing that goes along with that is Holocaust denial, which we've touched on a little bit as well. And, the importance of Jews fighting back. And, there's just so many things. I'll tell, if you don't mind me digressing a little, I'll tell a really quick story that, I was doing an Israel advocacy event, and I was really excited and proud and promoting it all over the place. And I was in Grand Central. I saw a guy with a kippah and I was like, oh, you should come to this advocacy event, and he goes, I pray. And I said, oh, I pray too. I said, but I also fight back. And the importance of, that it's not, they're not in and of itself, you can obviously be both and do both. And the importance of making sure that you know who you are, where you come from, but also that you're proud of who you are, and you know you're educated about it, and you can relay that to other people, and you fight back. You know, it's so important.
I couldn't agree more. And we come from such a proud warrior people, right? There's actually a book I finished reading about a year ago, and I recommend it to everyone. Maybe I can link it somehow at the end of the conversation. It's called Jews, God, and History by Max. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his last name correct, either Demont or Demont. Anyway, but he's not Jewish, but he wrote one of the most comprehensive Jewish history books I've ever encountered. And he doesn't talk about the Bible so much, right? Because obviously that's out there and it's common knowledge. What he talks about are all the Judean queens and kings in history that are not mentioned in the Bible, right? That stood up against armies, that raised armies, that conquered, that, swore off enemies, that expanded their territories. And a story I know that I had shared with you off camera a couple of days ago, and I think it's worth mentioning to the participants tonight, to the audience, is that my first trip to Israel, my first trip abroad for my bat mitzvah, I couldn't have one in America because my dad refused to send me to Hebrew school here. The rabbi was too liberal in his thinking. So we basically rented a rabbi when we got to Israel. Anyway, so we went up to the Masada, and my being 13 at the time, the rabbi was talking about Anne Frank because we had just learned about her in school. And he was saying something very poignant about her and her, and her own bravery, getting the story out. And then he started talking about the Judean warriors and what they had and why they had come to the Masada, and just how heroic they were. I was more interested in hearing about those Judean warriors than I was about, Anne Frank we had already covered, right? Like I already knew a lot about her, but I'd never heard of anyone mentioning the Judean warriors, right? And so when people say like, oh, Jews don't fight back, or Jews didn't fight back, like you said, like during the Holocaust, nothing could be further from the truth, right? Like you and I talked about this at some point. How many uprisings were there, right? How many partisan groups were out there? And the non-Jewish partisan groups very rarely shared weapons with the Jewish partisan groups. So for the Jews to get their own weapons in the middle of a war, while the Holocaust was going on, while there were so many barriers to defense and offense, the fact that any one of them succeeded and a good number of them did is beyond heroic, right? It's almost miraculous that they did. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I think are tasked to push back on.
It relates directly to today, right? Like to be proud and it's something in all transparency, I struggle with a little, up until recently, I had no problem walking around with my Israeli flag and my big Jewish star and being super proud. But I think that the more, anti-Semitism and the more the problems that there are, it's something that I'm embarrassed to say. Sometimes I'm not so open about it. And I think that's something I really need to work on. That part of helping combat and show people is being proud, being who you are, showing people who you are, standing up and fighting back. And it's exactly what can help combat everything going on, right?
It's literally in our DNA, right? Like we are from that land. And so another thing, like you just mentioned, right? So like, all the anti-Semitism that's happening today. And we both live in New York City, and right now it's dark outside. It's 8:30, but if it were light, I could literally point my laptop to where a Hamas rally was held in May of last year. And it was scary, right? And these people obviously are brainwashed, right? Because they're being taught one version of history, that Jews came, they, stole the Arab land, which obviously is not true. We have deeds, we have proof, we have history on our side. But it's, again, when we have, the famous quote or the famous saying is that 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? And that's wonderful to have discourse. It's great. But what's happening is when there's discourse on actual facts, right? That Jews, maybe some Jews aren't comfortable to saying that we're a race. Okay, that's fine. So maybe those Jews can say we're an ethno-religious tribe, but something that really verifies that we are a people, right? I can go to a Sephardic synagogue, I can go to a Mizrahi synagogue and obviously feel more at home, in those communities than I ever would in a church in Europe or even, St. Patrick's Cathedral here. And something that you mentioned to me about converts, right? So obviously we're very welcoming to converts, but at the same time, and I wrote this in my op-ed, is that we can't throw out our genetic connection to Israel just to make someone who converted feel not, that they're the same in terms of their genetics, right? So, people who convert, we welcome them, yes, like they're considered Jewish, right?
Lineage of the Mashiach. Yeah.
They are, like, they're no, like if we think about someone like Ivanka Trump, right? She keeps kosher. I do not. Sometimes I try to, but like so she, yes, like in her daily practice, obviously she's more Jewish than I am, probably ever will be, right? But she knows, and this is why I respect her so much in terms of her conversion, but she knows where she comes from, right? Like she knows her ancestry. She knows that she, yes, like she gave birth, to Jewish children. She's proud to be part of our community, and so many converts are. But then to say like, oh, because we have converts, among us, that we cannot say that we're a people, those who are not converts, I think that does a lot of harm, right? And that's what lends, to those lies. So like, oh, well, Israel doesn't belong to Jews because they have no peoplehood connection, right? And so I took a genetic test a couple of years ago. In fact, I took 3 because I wanted to just verify results. And all of them came back that I was 100% Jewish, all of them, right? Which is incredible because considering how many, obviously, generations and generations back, right? Like I would assume that there would be some kind of intermarriage, in my family tree. And I know that in other parts, like my extended family, that there are, just not in my immediate family. And in one of the tests, I actually was able to flush out further that I'm 92% Ashkenaz and 8% Sephardic, right? 6% Iberian found out and 2% Italian Jew. And it's to the point where I hopefully will go to Lucca, Italy, where Jews spend 200 years in a bottleneck, basically, before moving on to the Ashkenaz region. So I think that the more Jews try to connect to this genetic code that we share and try finding out for themselves, it just lends so much better to combating anti-Semitism, right? Because like now, we all go online, we see the lies, and it's so easy for me to combat that because I know exactly where I come from. I know where our people, comes from. And then that makes it that much easier to dispel the lies.
Right. As I said, not my area of expertise, although, I do struggle with the connection to the countries versus the connections going back further. But I think you touched on an important point about a unified message, having unity, which does not mean uniformity, right? Unity, a united message, a prideful message. I think that that's a really important thing that we struggle a little bit with. I just think that if we were more collaborative and unified, as you mentioned earlier, there's all these organizations, all these opinions, all these things, and I think that we need to find the things we have in common and build on that.
Absolutely. And then also, again, not erasing our Mizrahi Sephardic, brothers and sisters, right? They're very much part of our community, a very significant part. And, I think it's high time that they're included in these conversations, right? And so going back to one of the points you made, right? Like some people are uncomfortable, like in terms of, saying race. And I was doing research right around the time the BLM riots were starting. I really wanted to write a strong op-ed, right? And one of the things as an op-ed writer that you are asked is for sources, right? Like everything has to be sourced, which is great, right? It's not a college essay that you can just write your opinions. You state your facts and you have to back everything up with sources. And I was reading that the race as we know it, Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid, that was never actually a thing. Like, you know what that was? And to me, this is so interesting. Those were how to categorize different skull shapes, right? And that's how people were categorized, right? For how many hundreds of years. So it wasn't until the advent of genetics, right, which happened not so far away, or rather recently, only a couple of decades ago, we started to learn about haplogroups, right? And so they identified Jewish haplogroups, Jewish genes that were unique. This is how you and I were talking a little bit about this off camera, and we found it fascinating. All these crypto Jews, that were forced to convert, centuries ago, they're now coming back to the fold. And the way they're doing it is by proving through genetics that they're Jewish, that they're part of our people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to accept people who say they're Jewish, but I understand, like with your story, how it helped and how it could help others as well. I definitely think it's an interesting avenue, but yeah, ultimately, yeah, go
Absolutely.
ahead.
And then even I was just thinking about this morning. This jogged my memory a little bit. So, General Moshe Dayan, right, one of the greatest, Israelis, I think one of the greatest Jews of all times. And, he reunited Jerusalem. He overcame invaders left and right. But we have to be honest. And I heard this story from a mentor of mine who's been a Middle East expert for over 25 years. And he shared with me about a year ago at this point that Moshe Dayan actually made a grave mistake. That after he reunified, after Jerusalem was reunified, a lot of the Arab sheiks came up to him and said, look, this is not so well known, but a lot of our clans are Jewish. And we would really be interested in becoming part of the Jewish society in Israel, right? Like, we're working together, we're the same people. And Moshe Dayan, given unfortunately the time, at the Ashkenaz Mizrahi divide, he said, we have enough problems with Arab Jews. That's what he called, Mizrahis. We can't deal with actual Arabs, meaning like because of the racism, because of everything going on. And so my mentor, he made a great point. He said, now imagine if those Jewish clans that were forcibly converted, to Islam, decades ago at that point, even centuries ago, if they came back to the fold and were accepted, there would be less terrorism. And so he explained to me that, for example, in South Hebron Hills, 60% of the Arabs there are genetically Jewish. And that's also where some of the more notorious terrorists are coming from. And I asked him, I said, well, how is that? Like, why would they, like, if they know that they're Jewish, like, why would they turn against their own people? And he said that when a lot of these clans were converted, they had to show fealty to their new religion. And how were they asked to do that? They were asked to do that by killing, their former, tribespeople, which is Jews. And it's just mind-boggling, right? So I think that one of the bridges to peace in the future is through genetics, right? You see this on YouTube videos all the time, like Arabs taking genetic tests and they're finding out that they have Jewish blood in them. Some of them are happy, some of them are shocked, some of them are angry when they find this out. But I think genetics for Jews, I think is more of a positive, right? Like, there's so many, like, for example, like what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, like today. So, Israel, accepted, there are different numbers, like some say 25,000, some say 12,000. I'm not sure the exact number at this point. Obviously, it's a war, things are changing, non-Jews from Ukraine. But there's a delay in processing for a lot of Jews coming from Ukraine, right? Because under law of return,
they changed it a little, but yes.
Yeah, where it was, right? But still, like, how many more Jews are trapped in Ukraine, right? Trying to come to Israel. And so there is, like, someone reached out to me yesterday saying, like, oh, do you have an attorney? Because my aunt is in, needs to hire an attorney to deal with Israeli immigration. And I'm just thinking, if Israel had the resources, I'm not blaming Israel, I'm just thinking out loud, right? Like how this all,
Okay to criticize.
yeah, be
Sure.
executed, right? And that's the thing too, right? No country is perfect, right? How come Israel is always
Absolutely.
expected to be perfect in everything? But in terms of genetics, imagine if they, they had the resources to test these Arab clans all over Judea and Samaria. It would be, so useful to test Jews trying to flee from a war, and they would know in much shorter time, and then they wouldn't have to spend money on, immigration lawyers and using that money to rebuild a life rather than proving that they're Jewish, right? And also, when you had 70 years of communism interfering in religious life cycle events, many families came and proved that. So genetics does play a role, and we're so lucky that we have the technology these days.
And I find it fascinating. I think one of the main takeaways I'll say is going back to education, right? Like all of this is all about education, educating yourself, being able to educate others, being able to look into these things. And I think it's also important to note that regardless of who you are and where you're from and whatever, I mean, this is the first time in history since we've reclaimed, reclaimed sovereignty, I guess I'll say, that all people of all backgrounds and all faiths can freely be and practice in Israel. And I think that, so regardless of who you are, where you're from, what your genetics are, the reality is that Israel is a Jewish democratic nation that you can practice and be. So, I think that's an important takeaway as well. And again,
absolutely. And it's all about education, right? I don't think, or I actually know that, there's so many people that are actually not anti-Semitic, right? They just don't know better, right? And so if they were educated, and how many times did I spread mistruths growing up, right? Because people would say like, oh, what is Israel? Is it, is there apartheid there? Is there not? And I would spread lies because I didn't know better, right? It wasn't that I was anti-Semitic. I was ignorant. And I think it all starts with Jews, right? So like we can't expect non-Jews to know that we're not white. We can't expect non-Jews to know anything about Israel when we're not all on the same page, right? And like you said, like we're such a tiny minority. It seems that we're one of the few minorities, or I think maybe the only minority that's so tiny that can't get our own history facts in order. So anything to help that, I think it's so helpful. Like even knowing our own history in the US, right? So Jews were by and large always considered the other here, right? Like we had quotas on, education. We had job quotas. I mean, until what, like even 1982, I believe, there were restrictions in residential, and housing options for Jews in America, even in Florida, right? Like where Mar-a-Lago is, like Jews and Blacks.
No Jews, no Blacks, no dogs, right? That was
right. We both know, I think we know the same CEO who said, he grew up in Texas as a Jew and he had swimming clubs that said the same thing, right? Like no Jews, no Blacks, and something, another word I would never say, and no dogs, right? So to them, like we were all, a different race basically, right? Because they didn't know who was observant and who was not, right? Like who attended shul and who ate bacon or who abstained from bacon, right? Like to them, it's just you're a Jew and you're a Jew. So I think to erase all of that, to try to now be the majority, right? And there's nothing wrong with white people, right? They're like white people. There's a lot of positives.
It's okay to be white. We're just not, but it's okay.
Absolutely, it's very okay to be white, but at the end of the day, we're not, right? And there's something to be celebrated about that also. And like just to tie this portion up, right? Like we were saying, like we never felt white growing up, right? Like even though, like I said, like I thought I was white. I said like I was of Russian descent, but I always felt different than my white friends, right? I couldn't pinpoint why, but I remember, thinking, oh, my family does this differently. How come my family, talks to their to grandparents, like every single night, right? Like my white friends are not doing that with their grandparents. Or how come there was such pressure on, going to a certain college. Like there were just so many different values, and not to say our values are better or worse, that they were just different, right? And so
Traditions and cultures. Yeah.
and traditions, right? Exactly. So I did want to ask you, as a Jewish leader, what is your opinion on how best to combat today's most prevalent form of anti-Semitism, which, as we had mentioned, is anti-Zionism?
It's definitely a challenge. Thank God there's a lot of organizations out there, but and again, there is a need for some new initiatives that help fill in that gap of having that educational content. So I'll just bring it back to taking back the narrative for a second. But I think one thing, the IHRA definition, IHRA, of the official kind of definition of combating anti-Semitism, I guess you could say. But most Jewish organizations, I would say, have signed on to the IHRA definition. And, it is the working definition of anti-Semitism, and it's used when municipalities sign on, sports teams, universities. It could be used in courts by police, things like, hate crimes and whatever. And I think that it's super important that we have this definition. I mean, is it enough? No. Is it the be all end all? No. Is it exactly represent everything to every one of us? Absolutely not. But I think it's a great start and a great way that we can utilize it, and we can, it definitely does help by putting it out there officially and legally, and the more people that sign onto it and agree to it. And again, it's something that unifies us in a way as well, and it helps educate people as to what anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is, and how to combat it, and what you can utilize it as a tool in order to help. But I mean, again, other things I'll reiterate, educating yourself so you can educate others, being proud, these are all things that we can continue to do. We need to continue to work on our messaging and our marketing, work in social media, figure out the generational gap of, just because something worked in the past doesn't mean it's going to continue to work. And we have to listen to younger people and understand. And, I'll say one more thing. I keep reiterating the importance of the initiative that you launched and I'm involved with, but there are so many organizations out there, right? AZM represents 40 national Zionist organizations. And, I think that before people start creating even more new initiatives and other things, to do their market research, to understand that there's plenty of things out there that they can get involved with. Get involved, sign up. Somebody asked as to one of the questions, how do they get involved to work in the field, right? So there's some great sites. I'm always happy to share resources. You don't have to necessarily, be religious or observant or whatever. But, whether it's that you have those tools that you want to help and get involved, or whether you need to gain those tools and you're looking to get involved, there's plenty of organizations and things, and I can name them, but, and there's things probably I don't know about, which is a little crazy to me, but it does happen that sometimes I say, oh, I have a great idea. And people go, this organization's doing that. And I go, oh, I didn't, here I am, I'm busy doing my job all the time. No, I didn't know about this other organization or this other new thing, and college campuses. I mean, there's a lot of organizations to get involved with, everything from, the Chabads and the Hillels to the SSI, and just there's so many different avenues. And again, there's also legal avenues, as I mentioned with IHRA. There's ways that if your campus, first of all, IHRA can help your campus create, a platform to use, or sanctions in sports or whatever it is. But also, if you're not being allowed to create your campus club, or you're having issues or situations, there are legal actions that you can take as well that are important to note.
All excellent advice. And then also a continuity to the past, right? Like a generation that is unfortunately passing away. Off camera, you had mentioned a foundation that's near and dear to your heart, the AdoptASafta Foundation. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So AdoptASafta is an organization that pairs young adults with seniors, specifically, Holocaust survivors, like a focus on Holocaust survivors. And it's a really beautiful and special initiative. And I think it's important to especially do things like that while we still can. Yes, Holocaust education needs work and isn't always there, but I think that we need to take the tools that we have now and make sure that we can honor them while we still can. I know in the United States, a lot of states don't have Holocaust education. And I think that there's a lot of people that don't know what it is. There's still a lot of people that, I even know people personally that deny the Holocaust or the extent of it. And, I don't want to get too off topic, but I think that it does go a little bit in line with, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, Holocaust denial. Those are the things that, are super important. And in fact, there's a new task force that AZM just launched combating anti-Zionism, and these are all things that hopefully will continue to create the change. And, it's just, I think it's so important.
I find it fascinating from a personal standpoint that some of the very people that deny the Holocaust then turn around and blame Jews for only coming to Israel after the Holocaust. So which one is it, right? So what was there a Holocaust? Was there not a Holocaust? Like how in their mind are they even justifying those lies? Is a little bit insane. And I think another thing that, to me would actually be helpful is having that broad definition that I know that you mentioned off camera, that how you define, right, what Zionism is, right? The liberation.
National liberation of the Jewish
National
people, right?
Right.
It's not racist. It just says every people, can aspire for a homeland and a peoplehood. But the one thing, so AZM is based off of the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, which again, every 5 years or so we have a Zionist election. When Herzl created the concept of the modern state of Israel, he called for all Jews to come together and have a voice and a vote in the peoplehood. And so we today, we still hold the Zionist Congress elections. Just 2 years ago, we held the 38th Zionist Congress. And so we run it for the American Jews in the United States. And we send representatives to go represent that. And the one thing that unites all of these organizations and all of the people, they come to the table signing on to the Jerusalem program, is what it's called. And you could find it on our website, but basically the Jerusalem program discusses the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And it says how Israel is a Jewish, Zionist, democratic, and secure state, and is the expression of the responsibility of the Jewish people for the continuity and future. And it has a lot of other things, but that's basically the gist of what, when you say you're a Zionist, what you're coming together, unified, and agreeing to.
Yes, and a
lot of people don't know that, right?
I personally did not know that until I voted in the last World Zionist elections. That's right. The only reason I know about it. And I would love to, as this initiative grows, to sign up to the same Jerusalem program. Hopefully that could also somehow be arranged. But no, that's true. And so, also another lie that I always hear, and I just want to know your own opinion, how you tackle it when you hear, I'm sure you hear it in your own life as well, was that Israel was not created, right, until 1948, or there was no Israel, right? And I used to believe that too. It's like, oh yeah, Israel just happened to be created in 1948, until you study the history, the facts, and you realize, no, there actually was always an Israel. The issue was that Israel was occupied, right? That we didn't have our own army. And so it was Jews who liberated Israel. Like it wasn't the UN that liberated Israel. It was our blood. Lots of blood was shed. Imprisonment by the British to liberate our homeland from the occupiers. So how do you? And I know we didn't go over this before.
No, that's okay.
No, I talked about it. But yeah. So how do you tackle that misconception yourself?
I mean, as you said, for thousands of years, we've had a presence. There's never been a time where there wasn't a presence. Maybe it was called something else, but Israel has always been there. There's no question. I mean, for thousands of years, next year in Israel, next year in Jerusalem, and this is the first time in modern history where we can go and live and I'll say settle the land, which again is not meant to be a controversial term. It's really something in the Jerusalem program as a Zionist that we have the right to be in the land, to settle the land. And I think it's really important for people to understand. I have some friends and I'll say, oh, Israel, oh, I don't really feel the same way. Like I'm an American, and do you not remember it wasn't that far off in history where Jews they were turned away from coming to America, and I think it's so important. And part of the way I justify not being in Israel today, when here we yearned to be back in our homeland for so long, is that I'm here almost as a shlicha, as an emissary, doing work, connecting American Jews to Israel and to the Jewish people and to our peoplehood. And so I think it's really important to recognize that and understand that, Shema Yisrael, we've for thousands of years, this is who we are. This is where we come from. This is just who we are as a people. And, the more we know, the more we can stand up for it, the more we can explain it to people.
It's in our veins. Like, absolutely. I was sharing this with you off camera that when I went to Judea and Samaria, well, first of all, I personally very strongly think it would be helpful for all Jewish youth programs to be taken to Judea and Samaria, right? I don't think any are. I know when my sister was on Birthright, they didn't take her to Judea and Samaria for whatever reason. Other programs I've been on have not gone either. So for me, it was on a Chabad trip with JLI in 2018. We went and I stood on those hills in Judea and Samaria. I've never felt more rooted than being anywhere in my entire life. I've lived in New York for 17 years. I'm a New Yorker through and through. I'm a very proud American, love my country. I know obviously you love, being an American too. When someone says what's your nationality? I'm American, but when they ask, what's your ethnicity? Then I say Jewish, right? And so standing on those hills in Judea and Samaria, it was indescribable, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of, I don't want to say a religious experience because I don't want to, conflict the two, but it was almost this opposite feeling of an outer body experience. It was this inner body experience, right? Mm-hmm. Just something was pulling me right to the history of our people, right? Like I could sense like the shepherds and the warriors and the battles and the history all come alive. And I just don't feel that way. Even let's say, I love Tel Aviv, but I don't feel that strong of a pull in Tel Aviv as I did in Judea and Samaria. And obviously
I hear a lot of stories of people, oh, I'm going to Israel on birthright or this or that or whatever, and they're very, nonchalant. I'm going on a vacation. I'm going to hang out, whatever. And they'll get to like the Kotel and you'll see them standing there crying and feeling that connection to the land and the people and the history. And, it's beautiful. I think, even the concepts of the terms Judea and Samaria that are so important to reiterate, but many people, I think, don't even understand or know about that. And again, that goes back to the importance of the work you're doing, the initiative, the site, to explain to people to understand what this means, what's the history, why we're using this language, what it looks like, what the connection is, why you felt that when you were there, what that means, like how it is resonating, and it's, this is who we are, where we come from, and it makes sense, and again, like I said, the first time when I landed in Israel, I made sense. I understood who I was. I understood where I came from. I understood who my people were, and I think that's all just so important.
I might, you just gave me an idea that for a future video, educational video, we're going to have it say Israel, making it make sense. It's just so true, right? Why does it make sense, right?
It makes sense, right?
Making sense, absolutely. And, and thank you for pointing
Although
out.
I'm sure somebody will make a Jewish trope out of the sense. So be careful with that. You always have to think of the negative.
We will be ready for that. We'll have our shekels ready to roll out. But no, but it's true. And so, I again, like doing research, for this initiative, I didn't want to just spew facts, without digging, for evidence. I was just amazed that there were so many Mizrahim aliyot to Israel, for centuries. When we think about, let's say, the Kurdish Jews, right? Like I think of 1950s, the great Kurdish Aliyah. Well, much to my surprise, the first Kurdish Aliyah to Israel was actually in the late 16th century. No one knew about that. I think we need to talk more about the makeup of Israel, prior to 1948, prior to liberation, that it was mostly Sephardic Jews after the Inquisition, right? Ladino was the lingua franca, right, of Palestine. There's this wonderful book, The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, although it's fiction, but it's based on historical facts. And there was a big part of the story is that these young women, one of whom is more beautiful than than her sisters, Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, and she falls in love with an Ashkenazi man, and over this she's basically being threatened to be disowned, right? Because Ashkenazi were such the minority at the time that they were being discriminated against, right? So I think it shows just like a fascinating layer of history, right? Or what about the Jews of Peki'in up north, right? They were direct descendants of the priestly class that hid from the Romans and became farmers. Just having that added to trip itineraries.
I was going to make another bad joke and say that they could have avoided those Jewish genetic diseases if they did that, but never mind.
Yes. No, but it's, but like to me, so like I really wanted to share, with first my audience, and my audience is now everyone on the advisory committee's audience as well, these fascinating Jewish diversity facts that it's not really,
which will be up on the website soon, by the way, right?
Yes,
we'll make our debut. We'll announce it.
Absolutely, right. And so I just think that American Jews, I think it would behoove a lot of us, and I say us collectively, not to think of us as this one-dimensional facet, right? Even the Jews here, right? They're Jews from, so many places, right? They're proud Syrian Jews, and they're proud Gorski Jews and Boharian Jews, right? Just from all over, South America has fascinating, ties to even, Ashkenazi, and how my own, in my own history, in my own family, I had great uncles in 1904. They were sick of the anti-Semitism of Tsarist Russia. And so they escaped to Argentina and became cattle ranchers. And I thought for sure my family was unique. And I come to find out that basically all Jews in Argentina trace back to escaping from Tsarist Russia in the early 1900s. Like who would have thought of that fascinating history, right? So I think there's just so many layers, or even, to India, right? Like there are Indian Jews who got to India who were Sephardic, they were traders through Persia. Then there were Ashkenazi groups who got to India. They were another group who capsized also through the Silk Road and ended up, in India. So it just, but our provenance, right? Like what is all of our root? We can find Jews anywhere across the world, right? How many Chabads are there? We have Chabads in, even Fiji, right? But we have one homeland. And I think that's so important to keep repeating and educating, especially her younger people, right? When I look back to Europe right now, right? Yes, like I grew up, my first language was Russian, but I have zero connection, to the Russian people, right? Like,
I love that when people, so do you eat the food? Do you speak the language? Well, I did speak the language, but
so did you speak, what did you speak?
no, yeah, my family is Ukrainian, Romanian, Prussian. No, absolutely not. My grandmother spoke some Yiddish, but no, our food was traditional Jewish food, Ashkenazi Jewish food. I should clarify because it's very important. It's kind of like I remember in college they made us read a book and I loved it. It was like Jews and Blacks, and now I'm like, wait, Jews are Blacks. Like, I have friends who are Jews of color. Like, what? You can't, like, that's so funny to classify things like that, breaking down those silos. Again, it goes back to everything we're talking about unifying people, collaborating, having these messages. But, we had traditional Ashkenazi foods. My father actually was a caterer, Jewish caterer. We catered your seder, and chicken soup and matzo balls. Although I'll never forget, I got older and I went somewhere and I had cholent for the first time. And people are like, you didn't grow up eating cholent? And I'm like,
I didn't either.
No, that was definitely not something my family ate, like not something I had ever even heard of. Like I had no idea. And it's so interesting to think, again, foods and there's so much different culture, music, food, there's so many different avenues that we can celebrate the diversity of our peoplehood. And so many amazing things, we get credit for some things, we don't get credit for others, but either way, definitely food is always an important thing. And it wouldn't have been a webinar that discussed Israel, their Jewish people, if food didn't come up. So I'm glad we touched on it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's true, and something like, I really want to touch upon too, especially to our audience, on Facebook, like I'm part of some, I started cooking recently, more, especially, during the lockdowns. And I love Israeli food, right? Like I love Sephardic food, not, barking on Ashkenaz food, but, like my preference is Sephardic food lately, just because I didn't grow up with it at all. And I see so many Jewish groups food groups on Facebook, and they just assume that it's Ashkenaz oriented, right? But meanwhile, there's so many, Mizrahi recipes, Sephardic recipes, like other recipes that I think need to be, highlighted, as
I'll tell you, on Clubhouse, it is amazing. I mean, I haven't been on it much lately, but I used to run weekly groups and all different things, but there's such an amazing opportunity. Like, obviously, you should be out there trying to meet people, learn about all the different backgrounds and heritages and history and foods and all these different things. And one way, of course, is to read about it, attend programs, get involved, go, get involved with different organizations, webinars, things like that. But the best is literally you go to these Jewish food groups and you're talking to people and you hear about what they're making. They'll post a picture, they'll, and it's been such an amazing experience to hear the different Jewish perspectives that I didn't know about and that didn't, really resonate with me. And I go, wow, that's so cool. And I go, oh, that's part of my people, like, oh, wow, you make that kind of food and you do this and that. And I mean, I can't even pronounce half the foods that they'll tell me about that they just had celebrating the New Year this week, the Iranian New Year, was it?
Nowruz.
Nowruz. So yeah, I mean, again, it's just amazing, like seeing the pictures on Instagram of how they celebrated and what they're eating and how they made it. And, I get a little agita heartburn thinking about some of it, but I'm sure we can find ways to collaborate on that.
Yeah. Or what about Mamuna, right? Which is the Moroccan Jewish post-Pesach festival. I went
Who
to
doesn't love carbs?
Yeah, but and just also like just the tradition and the music and the ceremony about it. There's a restaurant here in New York. I went right before the pandemic, and Fairfax. I never knew that it was owned by a Moroccan Jewish family, right? Just secular restaurant, just American food. and they had this very intimate invitation only Mamuna celebration. And I went by I took my then non-Jewish friend with me, and we were just mesmerized, right? Like the owner's entire extended family came in their traditional Moroccan Jewish garb and music, and just I learned so much, right? That just I wasn't exposed to any of that. And then even, they're celebrating the Moroccan Jewish experience. And then they were explaining, like where their family, came to Israel. And it was all that going back to Israel and that continuous presence that we talked about while celebrating this fabulous Moroccan Jewish, festivity. So I wanted to ask you, I think all of these questions are important, but especially this one, right? So what can knowing about the continuous Jewish history in Israel teach us about how best to tackle the delegitimization of Israel? So I'll start off with one thought that I had, right? So for thousands of years, Jews were known as Palestinians, right? Like you go anywhere in the world and they would say, Palestinians, Jews go back to Palestine. That was a famous expression. Nice. So now that it's been flipped on us, so-called the script, right? So how best to share this continuous, presence, and how it does actually combat the lies about Israel?
Share your website. Have people, again, it goes back to all the things kind of to reiterate just about, education. If you don't know your history, if you don't know about, you can't stand up and tell others, you can't show people, you can't explain it. It's again, having that presence, having that connection, being able to share that history and explain it to people. Israel is an amazing place. But, the peoplehood, we're dispersed all over the world, right? And we speak languages, we look in many ways, and, Jews of all hues, but the one commonality and connection is where we come from, who we are, our language, our culture, the fact that we have this biblical language that we're connected to is amazing. And I'm embarrassed to say that, I'm not fluent in Hebrew, but it's something I aspire to. And I try and do as many Hebrew programming through my work that I can in order to share it with as many people, to just show them, about who we are and where we come from. And, I think it's a real challenge. And what other people are ever asked to prove anything about who they are and where they come from and their connection to their people and their land, right? So like, how scary. I mean, I was going to UN ambassador offices last week, and I literally, I'm so used to going to the Israeli places, the consulate, the embassy, whatever. And I was like all prepared with security and my this and that and whatever, and every place I like walked in, and I was like, how sad, how much of a focus and an effort that we have to spend on security, that we have to be so, this is something we're always watching our backs, and we're always, but we need to not just be on the defense, right? We need to be on the offense. We need to get it out there. We need to share our story. We need to tell people about who we are. We need to be proud, educated, and get that word out. Share positive stories in person, on social media, make those human connections to show people, that this is what it means. And so again, the continuous presence has always been there. We shouldn't have to prove or claim anything, but we can. And again, there's great resources, and you're sharing all the time on social media and on the site, and more things rolling out that will continue to show and be those tools for people to be able to share when they're maybe not sure and not so confident, or questioned, or gaslit, or whatever the case may be, where people push back and question who you are, which again, I don't think is something other people ever have to think about, right? I don't think Angelo ever stood up and said, what do you mean? I'm not Italian? how do you, my grandma, whatever, and my nana made the sauce. And what do you mean? Well, no, you know what? My people have a history, have a story, have a path. And, it's just that maybe people are ignorant, or maybe they're in denial, or whatever the case may be, or revisionist, right? In order to not let people rewrite our story, we need to tell it. We need to share it. We need to know it, embrace it, and just share it with everyone so that we can not have to continue to combat anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and all these ridiculous things. And we can live and be the beautiful democratic nation that we are, being a light unto the nation, sharing technology and food and culture and all these amazing, beautiful things, and stop having to spend so much money on defense and security and iron dome. I mean, this is so insane that, the hyper focus on Israel and the Jewish people, like, and get over it. We're here. We're not going anywhere. We've been around. We outlived all these other people. We're not going anywhere. It doesn't matter. We are small but mighty, and we will continue to be who we are and stand up for it and own it and embrace it and be proud of it. And, those are the only things. By saying that, by doing things like this, by having the conversation, that's the only way I think we'll create change and show people, who we are, what we do, and be able to not have to prove who we are, that people will know and it won't be questioned, is what I'd love to see, right?
You just made me a prouder Zionist just from hearing your answer to that. No, I really appreciate it. And it's something that
I didn't think that was possible, by the way, but go on.
Thank you so much. No, you did. I feel like you are, spurring us on to be even better Zionists, right? But I know it's something that I wanted to touch on something you said, right? Is like, we're a proud people. And of course, we have to honor and remember, the Shoah. But I think we also need to remember that we're more than a genocide that happened to us, right? We have such a proud over 3,500 year history, right? We're from these proud, like you said, like proud, powerful people. And so, yes, like we suffered obviously genocides and pogroms and all of that, but let's remember also the positives, right? The power that we have. I mean, and as you had mentioned, right? How many people revived a language, right? I literally think we're the only ones in the world who have managed to do that, right? How many people in the world, like they wish that they could liberate their homeland after having been occupied, not for 10 years, not for 40 years, not for 100 years, but try, a couple thousand years. It's yes, it's a miracle. And I know that people who are religious and observant, say like, oh, it's a miracle, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. But it also took just the perseverance, right? Knowing that we have no other homeland but this, right? We have no choice, right? Like you can kick us anywhere you want, but we're here. So, and we have that genetic proof to this land, right? Because when we talk about religion, religions don't have countries, right? Saudi Arabia, they're Arab, right? Like, yes, like they practice, Islam, and it's a Muslim nation, but Saudi Arabia itself is not Muslim just because they're Muslim, right? It's because the people, were practicing a religion, right? Just like our people, like we as a people practice our faith, right? And so it's the people that have the countries, and then develops the culture and the faith and the mores. And then, we took that and we transported that portal wherever we were sent off to in the diaspora. But our tree, right, our roots are in Israel. And it's such a beautiful not even story, it's beautiful facts, like of the provenance of our people. So I think this is a great place to conclude before we get to the Q&A. So let's see.
I think we've answered a lot of the Q&A, but I will say, the importance of like reclaiming Zionism and doing it before it's too late, right? As this ethno-religious group, nation, religion, culture, land, language, I think that, you hear all the time of our history being not only denied, but like literally destroyed, right? And I think that we just need to take action before it's too late and just continue to, uphill battle. And again, that's why now is the time where it's great that we're launching and providing the information that people can use to take action and to move forward and to really, but go ahead. Were there?
Yes, there are a few great questions. So one of them is, what should Jewish activists and Jewish college students do regarding the rising trend of anti-Semitic incidents? So what can college kids do to help combat anti-Semitism?
Right. I mentioned a little bit earlier about how there are so many different organizations that they can get involved with, on campus, and I named a bunch of them. And of course, I'm always happy to provide a resource and to be available if people have questions or needs. Know your rights, know when there's a legal issue. There's some really great examples of how people have combated what's going on, whether it's through, and there's still a lot of issues, but there's ongoing battles. Just this week, there was a whole issue at Tufts. I mean, every CUNY system, this, that, but knowing your rights, knowing also who can help, right? There's a lot of organizations out there, individuals, you have legal options, you have social options, but I do understand it's really challenging. As a college student, you have enough on your plate, right? You have enough to worry about. Like, do you want to be that token? Do you want people to call you out, to threaten you? There's professors that are a problem. And again, there's great organizations, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. We mentioned Gen F, they have the faculty fellowship program where they bring the faculty and try and educate them, right? So as a college student, not only can you get involved, but you should be able to know who you can go to, what your resources are, and how to be able to combat what's going on, how to be able to talk about it, educate yourself so you can educate others, be proud, and again, it is challenging, and I don't blame you on a college campus if you need to not always fight that battle. And that's a really hard thing. Like, we shouldn't have to. You should be able to go to class and have to worry about, learning what you're studying and thriving and having a social life and all the other stresses and things that, this battle isn't just yours. And thank God we do have a community, we do have organizations, we do have many avenues. Not easy, but hopefully, these are things and tools that will help.
I think that's a great informative. Actually, before we move on to the next question, I'm going to share with everyone both the link to TBTN and a link to AZM. Would you mind sharing what your website is to AZM?
Oh yeah, sure. It's azm.org, but thank you. But I'm here as an individual, and I'm really happy to promote TBN tonight, and feel free to post the website to all for sure. Thank you.
Perfect. Because you mentioned all those great resources, and I know that AZM is an umbrella organization, so I think that would be great for
and people can of course always reach out to me as an individual. I'm all over the place, and I'm pretty social, or they can reach you, and I'm happy to be able to provide resources or to point people in the right direction to get the resources that they want or need. I'm actually gonna repost it yours as a hyperlink so people can go ahead and click right now.
Perfect, thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions. The next one is sort of in the same vein. Why is there so much misinformation and lies regarding Israel on the internet?
That is a great question. I mean, people are anti-Semitic. Why? It's like, I don't know if it's a biblical and age-old, if they're just looking for a scapegoat. I don't know. It's really hard. I mean, listen, we're the people of the book. We've fought against all odds. And, I think there's a lot of general misinformation, but for whatever reason, there's this, there's a hyper focus on us. And I don't think that we're doing a good enough job of being we're always defensive. And something else I'll say, and again, this is not blaming the victim, but something that we could do better to help avoid this. As you said earlier, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, or 6 opinions, or whatever it is,
I minimum, yes.
You can't answer something about Israel or Jewish people or anything in an elevator pitch. Like, we have so much to say. Like, once you have that education and you have that knowledge, like if I ask you a basic question about like, oh, so how did Israel come to be, or whatever, basic question. I mean, you could literally talk for hours about that, right? And you're like, but I want to get it all out and I want to give you as much information and I want to share this and this and that. It's not a simple soundbite. Lies are simple. Lies are simple sound bites, right? Israel is apartheid. I can list for the next 2 hours how and why Israel is a diverse, beautiful, democratic nation. And yes, we can criticize and it has some issues and can do better in some areas, but it's an amazing, diverse, we're not, denying people, we're not committing any, genocide, whatever. I mean, how would you say in 2 seconds, somebody goes, Israel's apartheid or Israel's genocide? What's your social media answer in a tweet, right? Where do we begin? Like, we need those sound bites. We need those facts. And that's something that I've watched that you've been creating, right? How to get those quick facts and those tidbits that you can share. And it's hard. We want to share more. We want to tell more, but we need to, and also we have so many voices, we have such diversity, we have so many organizations. So, but if we can come together, one of the things I learned in this social media fellowship that when you introduced me, was about having that shared message and being able to like come together on what we agree upon, right? And share it, even if it's in your own way, but sharing it as a soundbite and standing by it, sharing it, be proud of it, and trying to get it out there,
You couldn't have answered this question better. And you're right. Like, if we have that common knowledge, from there, we can make it our own, right? In our own voices and our own perspectives. That's so true. And thank you so much for mentioning what, this initiative is trying to do. So there is a section on the website, we call it the highlight boxes, and it's called Fast Facts About Israel, right? So when you are going to the lion's den on social media, when you are in the lion's den, let's say with media personnel and even in person, and someone starts attacking Israel, you have those basic facts to then go off, right? We call it the 1 minute advocacy, right? Like, just the basic knowledge to dispel any lies. And a lot of that is rooted in knowing the history, right? Like, knowing about the Ottoman occupation, knowing about the British occupation, knowing what actually happened in 1948, knowing that, the Arabs were not kicked out of Israel, right? In fact, the mayor of Haifa was begging his Arab citizens to stay, right? That we're not here to harm you. Please don't flee. There's so many misconceptions out there that the website, really tries hard to address. And in terms of programming, in the coming months, we're going to be starting a class series, maybe a 6-part, perhaps 8-part, where people can sign up, and we're going to get into the actual historical details, right? With images, with sources, everything backed up, so that student or participants can have the sound knowledge that what they're sharing with others is rooted in facts, right? It's not opinion. It's actual historical, events that had transpired. So
I do think it's also important to note really quickly, just that, of course, because we have always more to say, but just that you're not going to change everybody all the time. There's a lot of people that aren't educated, there's going to be a percent of people. Don't waste your time writing back with somebody who's just a blatant anti-Semite, who's just not going to change their mind. They're not willing to listen. They're not willing to learn. That we can talk a lot about ways of advocacy or when and how to advocate. Always be out there, always be proud, but pick your battles sometimes, because you want to be as effective and be as impactful as you can. And it's not always the right time and place, or again, don't waste your time with just somebody who's just hateful and not willing to listen. I think
or
that's
sometimes you could be surprised, right?
Absolutely.
talking to this gentleman from Egypt, and he kept sending me anti-Semitic hate messages. And then something I'd posted, sparked an aha moment in him. And I'm proud, like, I don't think I can take credit, but maybe I helped facilitate a change in him. And he now runs a Zionist page. So
I do think that's true. You can never give up and never have no faith or hope, and it's important. But I know those moments on social media where you're stuck in those back and forths where it's like, nothing you're going to say.
You need to know when to stop. Right. Exactly.
Right.
But I do have to add this, and I'm sure you agree with me as well on this, is that, the Muslim Zionist community is such an untapped resource, like, for spreading knowledge. And that's something that TBTN is trying to, further highlight, build bridges with, especially in the future, is trying to give more of a voice, right? It's that there's so many more Muslims out there than Jews. And for a fact, most Muslims are not trying to kill Jews. And a lot of the Zionists that I come across, from the Muslim community, some of them are elevated, some of them are highlighted, but a lot of them don't know where to turn to, or, which Jewish organizations are good to partner with, or how to get their message out in a safe way. And we have to give, I think, as Jews, a lot of credit to them, because I know since 2014, since I've been a vocal Zionist, I've not had to spend one day in physical jail. I spent many days in social media jail, which is not the same. And, how many people do we know, who literally were hauled off to jail in, Iran and Egypt, literally for supporting Israel, so these people are putting their lives on the line to push back against anti-Semitism. So
you just reminded me also, by saying you're pro-Israel, by saying, it doesn't mean you're anti anyone else.
No,
and I think that that's a really important statement. Like, again, there's a lot more to unpack there. And you and I can literally talk for hours, as we often do and will continue to. But I just want to say thank you and say I'm so honored to be a part of this really important initiative. And yeah.
We absolutely. So I think that we can leave off on this last question. I think that it wraps up everything we've been talking about. This is from a participant. With such diverse perspectives within the Jewish and Israeli, community, how do we create unity around a historical perspective of our community and the importance of Israel to us historically? Right. So I guess what he's saying is, with all these different perspectives, here in America and in Israel, like, how do we unify on, agreeing on a historical perspective to share, and how do we meld those together to move forward?
Yeah, no, that's definitely.
Maybe I'll take maybe a stab at that. I think, again, it's just having that common knowledge, right? So it's not that, Israeli, historical events pertaining to, our provenance is different, from our perspective. I think it's just perhaps like a different emphasis, right? So, like, here in America, there was the American Jewish experience, right? In Israel, there's the obviously, the different perspectives. There's the Sabra experience, the Mizrahi experience, the overall Israeli experience, and just a different focus on everything. So, but I really think it starts, I hopefully in Israel starts with schools, right? Like, there they teach, I hope, actual Jewish history. Here, obviously in public schools, they don't, but it's then, asking those questions, right? Like, asking those questions of your parents, like, where did we come from even, right? And if someone's parents
doing your genealogy,
right, knowing your genealogy, like, and then digging deep, and not everyone's interested in genealogy, but then just, I think having that broad base agreement that all Jews literally are from Israel, and then, some stayed, some were forced out, some went by choice, right? Like the Jews in Yemen. I just learned very, very recently that, after the Jews in Yemen were there since right after the destruction of the first temple, and they weren't kicked out. They just went as traders, right? So they actually went by choice, built a very successful society, community there, but they're every bit as Jewish as we are, and have every bit of, connection to Israel, and they're from Israel. And I think just again, like just sharing those facts and being, and it also takes, I think, honestly, like government officials, right? So if the Israeli government were on the same page about, we can have a whole webinar about, who are Gazans versus Palestinian Arabs versus Israeli Arabs, that actually would help to have uniform terminology, having uniform terminology on saying Judea and Samaria. It's not the anti-Semitic West Bank, right? West Bank is a 1950 Jordanian occupation term, literally to steal the ancestral heartland of Israel away from Jews, right? So honestly, I think it's not so much the people themselves. I think ultimately it would be helpful if it came from government, like from the Israeli government. And I understand, right? Like it's hard for them because they're in the Middle
I'll
East.
introduce you to the Minister of Diaspora. We'll work
I will have a
together.
conversation.
But we all agree we were slaves in Egypt, right? I mean, I don't know. I think, again, I bring it back to today. Obviously, historical perspective is important, but again, more things like the IHRA definition and other things where we can say it's not perfect. It's not exactly the way I would say it or write it. But you know what? I agree. And in order to move forward, we're going to have to be a little flexible. And again, it's about unity, not uniformity. And we need to find those ways, and continue. But yeah, maybe there's other things that we can do to put that down, that, these are the facts of how it works, and all sign off on it. I don't know, maybe we can incorporate into the Zionist Congress, or
I
see
would
what
love
we can do.
It's true, like, that there, like, so we as lay people can say one thing, but, you're right. So, the government of Israel is in a very precarious position. They're in the Middle East, right? Like they're not here in America. They're not in Europe. They're not in South America. One word that's offensive and you could spark another war, right? So I think that a lot of times, even I had to grapple with that, right? As I'm reading the history of our people and our homeland, I always think like, oh, well, why couldn't they just do this and do that? And then you're right, like I have to myself, push back on that and say, oh, well, if they do it, then these are the consequences, right? So I think it actually is more onus on Jews outside of Israel to use correct terminology, right? And just knowing that there's real life, maybe the government of Israel has to say one thing, to keep someone
Also purposeful and educated terminology, right? So depending on how you feel, like use that terminology, knowing the terminology, right? Like knowing what you're using. And if you do feel a certain way, that's okay. Own it, use it, know it, and be able to talk about it. Don't, because again, there are very different perspectives, being that, AZM, for example, goes from, right, left, and everything in between, clearly I would get some pushback regardless of what I said and terminology I used from somebody. And that goes back to the point, right? How do we agree on that? And again, I think as long as you know it, you own it, you understand it, you can talk about it, it's okay. I know it's offensive. I understand the implications and the problems. And I think it's something to dive deeper in. But, I also think we have, as I said, we have to pick our battles right now in terms of like where we prioritize. We're going to hit it on all fronts. We're going to educate all around, but, maybe not agreeing on every single thing all the time right now. Like you said, can you ever get, Jews in a room to agree on anything? I mean, as long as I can articulate in an educated way why I feel the way I do. And, there are points where maybe we'll agree to disagree, but we'll agree on other things. And those are the things that maybe we'll highlight. And, it's a process, and it's something that it might take time, but, if not now, when? Like, we need to make it happen.
Right. And that's the thing, like, I really hope, and I'm sure you agree with me too, is that it would be great for Israel to go back to being non-political, right? Because when you erase, and that's the thing, obviously people who follow me on Facebook know my personal politics, but TBTN is not political, right? We're reaching out across the board. And that was done on purpose, right? Like, I could post political articles night, day, and everything in between. And I chose not to because I really don't want it to be a left issue or right issue. And so putting down those political barriers, I think would help to cement the historical truth, right? Using that correct terminology, it's not a left or right. It's not, this side says this and this side says that. It just, okay, these are facts, right? Like you can agree with them, you cannot, but these are the facts, right? So whether you choose, not you, but whether someone chooses to say them in their own lives, that's up to them, right? But just knowing that here it is. So that's the point of, TBTN is like, we're on a platter presenting the facts and people can take from it what they may and utilize it to the best of their extent. But I think it just would be a little bit easier if the politics were erased from the only Jewish homeland that there is.
Because I really enjoyed this. I really, it's who I am. I always say, if you cut me, I'll bleed blue and white, but really, even after, eat, sleep, breathing, it's really important. I learned a lot. I learned about you. I learned about, things about history, of things I want to look back up, things on your site. There was so much content. You're so full of knowledge, and it's really just a pleasure. And I'm really glad that you are focusing your efforts to continue to move Zionism forward and combating anti-Semitism and helping us understand who we are so that we can own it and move forward. And, it's so important.
Thank you so much. And I could not have asked for a better inaugural, guest speaker. You embody Zionism, you exude Zionism. Everyone can learn so much from you, and your leadership is just unparalleled. So I want to say thank you so much. Thank you for your time. I know we went a little bit overboard, but in a podcast style.
Thank you for everyone who joined us. And of course it is recorded. So if you missed part of it, we'll be able to share it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. It just, these are the kinds of conversations that are so important to have, and it expands our knowledge base, and just something, hopefully, if you found this informative, to share with others. And we hope to see you at the next webinar, which I'll be announcing in the coming weeks. So I want to wish everyone a good night, a good rest of the week, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacey.